All right, this is a reply to Professor Anton. Professor Anton's reply to nicotine too. And I would like to engage the 3 points now. Professor, please bear with me. If I seem overly dismissive of the first point, it's simply I'm going through 3 points. I like your points that you've made, and these three topics, these three areas. So first of all, on the increase of freedom, or somewhat how someone might phrase the way you have it, is the determination of our freedom, the inevitability that we are being forced to experience freedom. I think there is some truth to that. All right, I think there is some grain of truth to that. But I would say technically all life experiences freedom of an equal intensity of freedom. What we have is more self-consciousness, and the phylogenetic scale, to me, it's somewhat like something you don't want to refer to in polite company. It's anthropocentric. It ought to be called the anthropometric scale, something like this. It's a measurement of how like humans we are. There is no real phylogenetic scale anymore. It's ridiculous to say, that a lizard is below on some scale of a dog, when they didn't evolve from each other. They have common ancestors, and they fill their niches in different ways, and so on. So in reference to that, I have a negative reaction. But, if you just want to talk about there being more self-conscious animals and less self-conscious animals, perhaps make a scale of that. That might be interesting. And to the degree that that's what you're going for, fine. And this greater amount of consciousness, including self-consciousness, forces us to realize, by realizing the impact of our decisions, or the impact the decisions seem to have, that we're forced to face, our freedom to choose otherwise. Okay. The second point about the Can Robots Hug. Now, I didn't see the Can Robots Hug video. I saw the title. I might watch that. But I haven't watched that, so I'm just replying to the point here. I basically endorse your analysis. I'm a materialist, yes. Everything involved with consciousness has to be material by definition. But that doesn't mean that any material can contain a consciousness. And I agree, I don't see any reason to think that computers, as a complex material, can create consciousness. Now, I believe that these are Turing machines, these kinds of computers. And I believe that Turing machines could probably pass the Turing test. They can seem to have a personality. They could appear from outside to have a consciousness, but to have the subjective experience of a consciousness, I see nothing in a Turing machine. I'm pretty familiar with Turing machines, and I see nothing that could possibly create a subjective experience with a computer as we currently understand it. It would have to have some new component. That component would be a new aspect of the material. Perhaps that could house some sort of subjective experience. And in materialism, we assume, we could make a brain, and so it is possible, is copy the way it is currently done. And I think it's reasonable to suspect that there's other families of chemicals, for example, that could interact in the necessary ways that organic chemicals evidently do. But we'd have to find that stuff out. So on the third point, really two issues. One is, what is the motivation for a religious creation of religions and this sort of thing, and then relating that to transcendence. The reason being transcendence is sort of a metaphorical description of transcendence through the source domain of language. Well, on the motivation for religion, I think it is true that one of the big motivations for religion as such, institutions called religions, for example, or to be specific, is control. You know, that is the reason. But that's not the reason for spirituality. It's not the reason that people can be controlled that way. People can be controlled that way because it exploits their spirituality, a strong force in them. Um, so there is some sort of motivation also for this spirituality that is being exploited in the first place in institutionalized religion. And I agree, looking for those motivations is important. Not that you've been seeing it, but I basically argue that we can think of a thinking process as, you know, a named process, a way of thinking, an approach to problem solving, which takes perceptions as its input and produces perceptions as output as well. And they can be, I think for epistemological reasons, it's best always to consider them perceptions, but they could be perceptions of you doing something. You see the apple, you feel your hunger, or see, quote unquote, your hunger, and you add that up to picking up the apple and eating it. Well, you've created a perception of you eating the apple because that's the way you experience it. You see yourself eating an apple, you experience the flavor and everything else. So now, so we're in line with that. Now, the transcendence thing, I use the word enlightenment, but basically I think we're talking about a biological reason of some sort that it would help us to have this attitude. I don't believe there is a truly, you know, a traditional sense experience of transcendence. But what you can't move beyond what you're made of. But what you can do is you can reach levels of abstraction where what you're made of seems to be subtracted out of your reasoning. You don't really have to consider it. So, for example, we deal with in the big question epistemologically, the big issue. You know, is the world made of little BB balls like classical mechanics? Is it wave functions like quantum mechanics? Is it dream stuff and we're in the dream of some great dreamer? You know, there's levels of abstraction where we're talking about things where it doesn't matter if it's made of dream stuff or made of little BBs. And those levels of abstraction are generalizations. They take a lot of different situations into account. We talk about them and it deals with a lot of different situations, even situations where the arrangements are the similar part and the actual constituent matter is different. Now, on the other hand, of course, we disagree on your use of language as an example of this kind of transcendence. You know, the idea that the word apple doesn't have entropy, well, I think that it does. If a culture had no access to apples, they go extinct. You know, that term will, you know, undergo entropy really quickly, right? So, you know, it's this constant repetition. Now, it's the constant repetition which you mentioned is somehow this part that creates this special character. But I don't think so, because, you know, if you have an idea of an apple in your head, you're going to share this with other people. You're going to have the apple, and you're going to point out and say apple, and, you know, maybe other language to describe things about the apple, right? The energy that it takes in your mind, the energy and matter in your mind, to remember an apple, to have that conception in your brain. You know, the part of your brain where if you suddenly got a splinter in your brain, you could be made to forget. Whatever the energy involved with that, that's not enough to give everybody the idea. If you took that energy and distributed it, you know, and divided it down, just like cutting up the apple, it's not enough for everybody to have a conception of the apple, right? There is no magic property of the concept of apple that makes that possible. What happens is you make noises that take less energy than that. And then everybody of their own, using energy that they got from food they ate, amplifies that and recreates and builds this idea. And you can see this in the fact that if people aren't listening, don't know the language, or even hear the words and repeat yeah, apple, they might forget it later because they don't do the thinking. They don't put the energy into recreating the concept to amplify this source signal that's being produced, and put their own energy in. You know, similarly, if somebody's playing a sound over a loudspeaker and you're going to record it with 10,000 tape recorders, There's no property in that sound that makes it duplicate itself reliably. It's all up to the tape recorder. And note specifically, the important thing is each tape recorder has an energy source, it has its batteries. And it's through its amplification process. The energy stored in the source tape and even the energy going into the sound waves is not sufficient to store this on 10,000 or a million. And to do it in 10,000 or a million, that takes different amounts of energy. There's nothing in the sound or the concept or the information that makes it easier to copy or doesn't, not affect entropy. No, it does affect entropy. Every material form, it physically does in the medium, but also conceptually, metaphorically. If it's not used, if you don't reuse it and keep putting energy from the food you eat and the batteries you put in your tape recorder and putting energy into keeping it alive, it decays. You have to keep putting energy into it. A physical apple, it's like if there was a way to increase the longevity of a physical apple, but you keep having to feed the apple and give it the medicine and the immortality medicine. There's nothing in the concept that makes it duplicate itself. It has to do with systems and information systems and the way arrangements can be mapped from one system into another system, from sound pressure waves into magnetic field levels on a tape, And the fact that it can be mapped from one into the other and back, it doesn't defy any of these basic laws of entropy. And when you transcend reality and transcend something like entropy and get into a place where, wow, it's as if words aren't subject to it. No, they're still subject to it. You've constructed something where you can subtract that effect because you're putting in energy to compensate for the effect. But you don't ever want to forget you're putting that energy in. You have to remember, don't change your whole philosophy and go, my metaphysics can be this, that, and the other now, because look, there is this magical thing that defies these laws. I now know there is. We wondered if there was. Well, there is. No, there still isn't. You're putting energy in to create the artificial status of this. Why? Because it's useful. It creates regular systems. Using like idealized Newtonian mechanics, which ignore friction and not to mention, general relativity. This is useful, these simplifications. We use them because they're useful. And we don't want to make the mistake of thinking that's the way the world is just because we're using them because they're useful. So, if you really look at what a word is in someone's mind and with the concept and everything, it's energy in there. That's not infinitely fungible. That can't be divided infinitely any more than the physical apple can be, if you think about it. Okay. On the other hand, I agree these are very important subjects. I hope that you understood where I'm coming from on them. And cheers.